As Sheridan's only American game design student this year, I felt it was my calling to talk about Papers, Please. The current climate of my country versus the relative sanctuary that you all inhabit in the North had nothing to do with this decision. Because my only accomplishment in life has been receiving an English degree, this breakdown will be focused entirely on narrative, because that's all I'm good for. In the case of Papers, Please, ludology and narrative are inseparably intertwined. Papers, Please is pretty much just a text-based game. All the gameplay elements come down to the players organizing and analyzing information. Because of this, the narrative is the gameplay. The discourse of the game is really something special. The player is put in a position of authoritarian power, with their dialogue leading the conversation. However, at the end of every day, the player is delivered the harsh reminder that they are not really in power, when they are forced to face their impoverished living conditions. This is further enforced by the commands and inspections from higher-ups, who often visit the player's booth. Much of the gameplay revolves around tedium, repetition, and attention to minute details. From the lens of reception theory, the game uses the player's real-life experiences with monotony and bureaucracy to really punch home that feeling of endless paperwork and long lines. This is something that I relate to on a very personal level.
Come on.
The narrative is mostly enacted. Significant events, such as important people or commands, will occasionally appear to shake up the revolving door of forgettable faces. Through the scarce appearance of significant characters, the game manages to tell small, poignant stories of its authoritarian world. Some may consider the narrative to be embedded, but I'm personally opposed to this idea. In my opinion, a newspaper with the story literally written out on it doesn't count as environmental storytelling, and it doesn't leave much up to the player's discernment. Papers, Please pushes the limits of the player's morality in order to elicit strong emotional responses. The game often rewards immoral behavior, such as corruption or turning away a person in need, as a means of self-preservation. There is an implied narrative being pushed with this decision, one that says, in a world such as this, you are no better. What is interesting is that not only does this game reward immoral behavior, but it punishes moral behavior beyond the omission of benefits. Doing a good deed can get you reported, or, in the case of my playthrough, killed. What Papers, Please presents is a flipped binary opposition, where the concept of good and evil have been swapped in their outcomes, at least in a traditional narrative sense. This is done to convey the backwards nature of the totalitarian world the player inhabits. And speaking of, while this game examines the ideology of authoritarianism, its commentary extends far beyond a simple criticism of Soviet communism, which is the outwards message of the game. Papers, Please speaks in depth about issues of xenophobia, corruption, oppression, identity, and many other topics. While the aesthetics of the game most call to mind the long decay Soviet Russia faced during the years of the Cold War, the absence of any specifically mentioned political alignment leaves these commentaries open to a more general examination. In simple terms, Papers, Please doesn't tie its message solely to Russian communism, but rather to the issues in and of themselves. What I found most interesting were instances of individuals who were possibly transgender. There's a new layer of complexity in these moments, and the knowledge that even the slightest bit of misplaced lenience on your part will lead to your demise heightens the stress of the situation. To me, this is commentary on the history of oppression LGBT individuals have faced throughout history, and in many cases, continue to face at the hands of totalitarian and oppressive governments. In a world where an error on a document can lead to your death, what can you do when the government disagrees with your identity and assigns you their own? In spite of its simplistic graphics, there's a lot going on in Papers, Please, and the game has much to say on some complex issues the world faces. In the end, I'm really glad that it's physically impossible for politics to be in video games. Otherwise, Papers, Please would really force me to use my brain.